Hello, welcome to our Herstory panel, packed full of insights into historical fiction written from the point of view of women. I'm Jo Mackay, Head of Local Publishing for HQ at HarperCollins. The authors you will see on the panel today were all originally destined to be part of our Herstory tour, a series of bookstore and library events throughout autumn this year, which has now, for obvious reasons, moved online. And they're all authors who write historical novels that put a strongly female, often rebellious perspective front and centre of their narrative and deal with issues important to women at the particular time of history they're writing. Each of these authors has books in store right now. This panel will be a quick meet the author, meet the book, a kind of literary speed date, if you will. And we will also have available a more in-depth individual interviews with each author. So if you like what you see, you can watch more. All of this literary goodness can be found at harpercollins.com.au/herstory. So let's make some introductions first. First we have Tia Cooper, an established Australian author of historical fiction. In a past life, Tia was a teacher, a journalist and a farmer. These days she haunts museums and writes. She has written numerous novels, including last year, The Woman in the Green Dress, and today she'll be talking about her most recent novel, The Girl in the Painting. Next we have Karen Brooks. Karen is an academic, a newspaper columnist and a social commentator, and she appears regularly on national TV and radio. She is also the author of 13 books, including last year's The Chocolate Maker's Wife. But today she'll be talking about her recently released book, The Darkest Shore. Marianne O'Connor is the author of 5 novels, including In a Great Southern Land, released last year. With a career in marketing behind her, Marianne now focuses on her writing. She'll be discussing her just-released novel, Where Fortune Lies. And last but not least, we have Kerry Turner. Kerry trained from a young age to become a ballerina, but life had other ideas for her, so she combined her love of ballet, history and books into her first novel, The Last of the Romanov Dancers. Today she'll be discussing her most recent book, The Daughter of Victory Lights. So let's move on to the questions. Firstly, and I'll start with Tia if I could you give us a 1-minute insight into your book, what is sometimes called an elevator pitch?
The Girl in the Painting tells the story of Miss Elizabeth Quinn. She's something of an institution in Maitland Town, and when she's found cowering in the corner of the exhibition gallery, everyone knows something strange has come to pass. Jane Piper is determined to find out. She owes her life and her education to Elizabeth. But as the past and the present converge, Elizabeth's grip on reality loosens, and Jane finds herself fighting to unravel Elizabeth's story before it's too late.
And now Karen.
The Darkest Shore is based on a true story, and it's set on the east coast of Scotland between the years 1704 and 1705. And it's about a tragic, brutal witch hunt. And it involves a group of fishwives who are terribly maligned by the local reverend, who's this dreadful, malevolent man who just has taken a stand against the women. So they're falsely accused, and it's what happens as a consequence of that, how the accusations of witchcraft not only tear the personal lives of these women apart, but in fact the entire town.
Thank you. Can we move on to Marianne?
Where Fortune Lies is the story of Anne Brown, who's a poor Irish girl, and she lives a very ordinary life. She's very unhappy and very brown on the outside, and people look over her. And after a terrible misfortune, she decides to flee Ireland and reinvent herself. So she seeks her fortune on far shores. She ends up in Australia in 1880, and this is the end of the bushranging era, so it was a really exciting time to write about. And so it's just a story of adventure and passion. It's also a story of Will and his sister Mary, who are entangled in her web, and Charlie, who becomes the love of her life. So yes, it's just big adventure up in the high country in Victoria in 1880.
And finally, Kerry.
So The Daughter of Victory Lights follows Evelyn Bell, who, thanks to her work in England's first ever all-female searchlight regiment during World War II, receives a post-war opportunity to join the Victory, which is a boat which plays host to an illegal travelling burlesque show. On board the Victory, Evelyn and the other characters have to face the things they did during the war years, who it was they thought they were, and who it is they want to be. while 10 years later, a little girl called Lucy is beginning a new life on the Isle of Wight and desperately searching for answers as to what happened to the mother that she never knew.
What was it about this period of history that inspired you to write this book? And we'll start once more with Tia.
It's set in two different time periods, the 1860s and the early 20th century. The 1860s in Australia was a period of upheaval and contradictions. The gold rush saw an enormous influx of people to Australia from all corners of the world, and it was the beginning of our multicultural society. Unfortunately, it also spawned a rash of prejudice and fear which dictated many people's choices and had long-lasting consequences. 50 years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, fortunes had been made and lost, and most importantly, women had found their voice and a new degree of independence. But the implications of the past had huge ramifications for anybody who'd lived through both eras and provided a wonderful canvas to explore the emotional conflict of the time.
And now Karen?
Basically, everything about this period absolutely inspired and gripped me. But I think it's also because there are so many untold stories in the annals of history. And what I love about being a writer of historical fiction is that we become like archaeologists and we get to sift through all the layers and uncover these amazing stories about particularly women. And in the case of The Darkest Shore, it was about these women that endured this incredible injustice and what happened to them and how they survived or didn't. And I just think it's sort of incumbent upon us as writers of fiction to grab the facts and then put creative flesh on history's dry bones. And that's just a real privilege. And I just love that about writing historical fiction, not just this book, but particularly with this one.
Thank you. Can we move on to Marianne?
I really wanted to write about this era because when I was growing up, I really loved The Man from Snowy River, and to set a book up in the Australian high country was always a dream of mine. So when I had the opportunity to write about this poor Irish girl coming over here during that time, I thought what an incredible place to be, because it was Australia's Wild West. We had these pioneers trying to eke out a living, and they were really, it was the goodies versus the baddies, according to the public anyway, who lived out there. That the police were maligned to be quite brutal, and there was that sense of underdog and a big following of Ned Kelly and so on. So to me, it really came to a big, wonderful dramatic ending with the arrest and execution of Ned Kelly. But what about all the people that lived there and what was going on at that time? So I really thoroughly enjoyed writing about that era in Australian history.
And on to Kerry.
Yes, so when we think of the years following World War II, it's kind of natural to assume there were years of great celebration and joy, but there were also years of great repression and silent suffering, really. Post-traumatic stress disorder went largely unacknowledged. Women were expected to go back to rigid domestic roles while maintaining complete silence over their wartime work. And burlesque, which was an art form which had brought a lot of joy and laughter to people through very difficult years, was illegal because of censorship laws. And these were themes that kept coming up again and again throughout my research. So I kind of wanted to shine a bit of a light on them and give a bit of a voice to those people who did suffer in silence.
Thank you, everyone. Research is an intrinsic part of historical fiction. What was the most interesting historical fact that you uncovered and incorporated in your writing? Starting once more with Tia.
That's a very difficult question because I have a habit of falling down research rabbit holes. I was fascinated by the assassination attempt on Queen Victoria's son, Prince Alfred, mostly because I'd never heard about it. It happened in Clontarf in Sydney in 1868, and a man called Henry James O'Farrell just walked up to the prince and shot him. Fortunately, the prince wasn't killed. The bullet hit his braces and he survived. But poor old O'Farrell didn't. He was hung for treason. And it caused an outpouring of Irish sentiment in Sydney. And many people left Sydney, many Irish people left Sydney and headed for the goldfields, which brings me to Hill End. The history is fascinating, but the thing that I found the most interesting was the fact that there was a collection of 3,500 glass wet plate negatives which recorded life in New South Wales and Victoria during the gold rush. They're called the Holterman collection. But what really interested me was the fact that they weren't found until 1947 in a garden shed in the back of a house in North Sydney. There's a story in that alone. And serendipitously, I received a message the other day from one of the readers asking me if the photographer I'd mentioned in the story was Henry Beaufoy Merlin, because he was her husband's great-great-great-grandfather. So that was very, very cool, I thought.
And on to Karen.
Uncovered loads of really interesting historical facts, but I think one of the most fascinating, or actually there were two, is at a time in the 1700s when women were very much subjugated by the men, culturally, socially, religiously. In the village that I write about, Pittenweem particularly, which was reliant on fishing, the fishwives who helped the men and was so much a part of what went on and a part of the community were really quite independent, and they were really feisty, and as a consequence they were seen as really disruptive force, and rumours spread about them and gossip, and even at the same time that the village needed them. So there was this constant if you like, battle between needing them and wanting to get rid of them. And I found that really interesting. And on top of that, all the superstitions around fishing were fascinating. So, for example, if the men said the word pig or iron, pig or rabbit, they had to immediately touch iron. Or if they saw a man of the cloth, they couldn't, before they set sail, they were to not leave the harbour. And I think one of the interesting ones that involves the women too is the women used to carry the men on their backs out to the boats. And whilst that sounds like the absolute subjugation of women, it wasn't. If you think about it, it was quite pragmatic because it was freezing cold. And if the men got wet, the chances were they could fall ill while they were out fishing for hours and hours on end. So just all those lovely little things that you can weave into a story and give it veracity. They're really good.
And could we hear from Marianne?
I actually went researching to try and find out if there was anybody from real life I could draw upon. I was looking for a woman and I wanted a reason for reinvention. Why and how would you go about reinventing yourself as a woman in 1880? Because we had so little choice. There was very few jobs and they were quite menial. Women could not work when they were married. They were basically the chattel of their husbands. They had no rights, really. So I came across this character in history called Lola Montez, and she became my muse for Anne Brown. And she was just an ordinary Irish girl, but she completely reinvented her life. And she's a real person from history. And she ended up being a courtesan to the king, and she had this incredible life. She travelled all over the world. She had to flee as a political asylum at one point. She ended up on the Australian goldfields as an exotic dancer and invented the spider dance. And in the end, she died at the age of 39, working to try and give women refuge in America. So what a life. I've made her quite feisty, but I've mostly drawn upon those reasons of why she wanted to leave and take such an enormous risk and what options she had. And I quite like the idea that Lola didn't turn so much to prostitution, but it was quite burlesque. It was very erotic and everything else, but she did it on her own terms, and I was fascinated with that. So yes, Lola.
And now Kerry.
Yes. So the most interesting thing that I learned about while researching and writing this book was definitely the UK's all-female searchlight regiments. Not only the dangerous and highly skilled nature of this work, which was spotlighting enemy Luftwaffe planes so that the anti-aircraft gunners could try to bring them down, and also helping friendly injured aircraft hopefully safely land, but also the difficulties that they faced in even being allowed to do this work in the first place. And then also the systematic silencing of this and other women's roles throughout the war afterwards in order not to insult or offend the returning servicemen.
Final question. What do you hope that readers will take away from your book? And we'll start with Tia.
Depends very much on the reader. I think two people can read the same book and take something completely different from the story. because our interpretation of events, whether they're fact or fictional, they're shaped by our own experiences. Right from the moment I started to write The Girl in the Painting, I wanted to answer the question, who is Elizabeth Quinn? But as the story progressed, I found I was exploring something a little bit broader, and it began to haunt me a little bit. And because I was wondering what would happen if you woke up at the age of 60 or 70 and realized you weren't the person you'd always thought you had been. We rely so much on what we're told of our childhood, and we blithely believe those stories. But will the reader take that from reading the story? Probably not. It depends on their experiences. The bottom line is it's the tale of Miss Elizabeth Quinn, and I hope everybody enjoys it.
And now Karen.
I just hope that everyone is as gripped by the story, the Witches of Pittenweem story, as I was. And for all that it's a quite brutal and bleak book in that it does detail what happened to those accused of witchcraft and what was involved in demonic possession and all that sort of stuff, it's also a book about female friendship, loyalty. It's about fighting social injustice and having just this courage and integrity. And it's about loyalty. And so it's got so many positive things. And I think it's also hope-filled in many ways. And I think it also explores how even good people can be swayed by a powerful voice to act against their best interests and against their better selves too. And I think they're really important lessons to take from history, because for all that we always say that, we don't want history to repeat itself, the sad thing is it so often does. So I guess it lies with us, that power. Are we doomed to repeat it, or do we make change? And I think stories like this one really put that there for us to make the choice ourselves, or make us think about those questions.
Thank you. On to Marianne.
Well, this is really a story about fate and seeking fortune. So I think everybody seeks fortune in different ways, and these characters, what's important to them at the beginning isn't necessarily what's important to them in the end of what truly matters. I really hope this is a strong message for people reading it right now, because people feel helpless and out of control of their fortune and out of control of their fate. But it's not what happens to you that matters, it's what you believe in and how you act.
And finally, Kerry.
Well, I hope for the same thing that I hope for from all of my books, and that's that readers will learn about certain historical roles that have kind of been forgotten about and sometimes deliberately erased, but also that they'll connect with my characters and the story and find themselves on an emotional journey with all the ups and downs of the human experience.
I think you'll agree that that was a fascinating insight into historical fiction and the writing process. As I said, if you would like to hear more in-depth individual interviews with any of these authors, please do go to harpercollins.com.au/herstory to hear more about their fantastic books. All of these books are available to purchase in bookstores, including those that offer home delivery. And of course, you can buy the ebook from all good retailers. Thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you enjoyed it.